Picture this. A corridor backstage at the Pantages Theater in Hollywood, 43 feet long, lit by a single row of fluorescent tubes that buzz just slightly off-key. The year is 1966. The carpet is burgundy. The walls are cream-colored plaster, and on one side there is a mirror, floor to ceiling, wide enough that two men could stand in it shoulder to shoulder and see everything. Two men are standing in it. One of them is 36 years old. He is 5 feet 10 inches tall, 168 pounds of coiled, restless muscle. He has green eyes that other men describe as calculating even when he is smiling. And he is smiling now, a slow, deliberate smile that does not reach those eyes. He is the fastest rising star in Hollywood. He drives race cars for recreation. He spent 2 years in the Marine Corps and never let anyone forget it. His name is Steve McQueen, and he has just said something in this corridor. Something loud, something pointed, something heard by at least 11 people. That was designed to diminish the man standing opposite him. The other man has not moved. He is 59 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, 222 pounds. His hands hang at his sides, and they are the size of dinner plates, and they are perfectly still. His face gives nothing away. Not anger, not amusement, not the faint flicker of wounded pride that McQueen was fishing for. He is looking at McQueen the way a geologist looks at a rock formation, with patience, with curiosity, with no particular urgency. His name is John Wayne, and in approximately 90 seconds, everything in that corridor is going to change. This is that story. To understand what happened in that backstage corridor on the night of March 14th, 1966, you have to understand the specific gravity of the room everyone had just left. The occasion was a private industry screening and reception for the upcoming production cycle at Paramount. Not a red carpet event, not a press junket, but the kind of closed-door Hollywood gathering where the real conversations happened. The Pantages Theater on Hollywood Boulevard had been reserved for the evening. Its 2,812 seats filled with roughly 400 people from the industry's upper tier. Directors, producers, studio executives, union heads, and a carefully curated selection of talent whose presence was itself a kind of signal. If you were in that room on that Monday night in March, you were someone. If you weren't, you knew why. The evening had begun at 7:30 p.m. By 9:15, the formal portion had wrapped, and the 400 guests had migrated to the theater's backstage reception area. A warren of green rooms, corridor spaces, and prep rooms that the Pantages staff had dressed for the occasion with folding tables, white linen, and enough whiskey to float a small boat. The air back there smelled of cigarette smoke, hairspray, and the particular blend of cologne and ambition that characterizes every room where powerful people are performing for each other. Steve McQueen arrived that evening already carrying something. Anyone who knew him well, and there were fewer of those than his public persona suggested, would have recognized the particular quality of his energy that night. He'd been moving through Hollywood at a velocity that had no precedent. The Great Escape had come out 3 years earlier, in 1963, and turned him from a known quantity into a phenomenon. Bullitt was still 2 years away, but the industry already knew what was coming. He had 3 films in production simultaneously that spring. His asking price had crossed the $1 million mark. At 36, Steve McQueen had become, by almost any metric the industry used, the most commercially bankable male star in Hollywood. Numbers tell the story cleanly. In the 5 years between 1961 and 1966, McQueen had appeared in 9 major productions. 7 of them had returned more than triple their production budgets. His Q score, the industry's measurement of talent, familiarity, and appeal, had climbed from 47 in 1963 to 71 by early 1966. For reference, the average working actor of that era carried a Q score somewhere between 15 and 30. His was nearly double the ceiling. He knew what those numbers meant. More precisely, he knew that everyone else knew what those numbers meant, and he had developed a particular habit. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of pressure testing, of seeing what happened when he pushed against the established order of things. The established order of things, in Hollywood in 1966, still had a name. That name was John Wayne. 24 films since 1950. 31 in the decade before that. A career stretching back to 1926. 40 years of continuous work in the industry, beginning as a prop boy at Fox Film Corporation under director John Ford and accumulating, film by film and decade by decade, into something that had no real equivalent in American cinema. Stagecoach, Red River, The Searchers, Rio Bravo, True grit was still 3 years away, but Wayne had already proven, repeatedly and in public, that he did not need critical validation to fill a theater. His last 4 pictures had collectively grossed more than $47 million at the domestic box office alone. At 59, he was not fading. He was settling, the way bedrock settles, not downward but into a permanence that makes the ground around it seem less certain by comparison. But here's where the dynamic gets complicated. Because Steve McQueen had not built his challenge on false premises. He was, by the numbers, Wayne's equal in box office terms by 1966 and trending sharply upward, while Wayne's trajectory had plateaued. He was the new thing, and the new thing in Hollywood has always possessed a particular kind of social license, the license to test the old thing publicly to see if it holds. McQueen used that license on the night of March 14, 1966, at approximately 9:47 p.m. The immediate trigger, according to 3 separate accounts from people present that evening, was a conversation about The Sons of Katie Elder, Wayne's 1965 Western, which had performed respectably but generated reviews that were less than warm. Someone in the group had brought it up, and McQueen had listened for a moment with that slow, calculating smile before offering his opinion. The opinion was delivered loudly enough for 11 people in the corridor to hear it clearly. It was specific. It was comparative. And it was directed not at the film but at Wayne himself. At his age, at the suggestion that a certain kind of story had passed him by, that the audience for what Wayne represented was dying off at a rate that the industry would need to reckon with soon. McQueen finished speaking and leaned against the corridor wall with his arms crossed. The 11 witnesses went quiet. John Wayne had not moved. He had come in from the theater's east entrance at 8:05 p.m., alone, without a publicist or an aide or any of the management apparatus that surrounded most talent of his stature at industry events. He was wearing a dark sport coat, charcoal wool, off the rack, the kind of jacket a foreman might wear to his daughter's graduation, and dark slacks and boots that were not decorative. His hair had gone mostly silver by then, and he wore it combed back without particular attention. He was, in the language of the room he'd just entered, underdressed. He did not appear to notice. He moved through the reception the way he always moved, at a pace that was unhurried without being slow, pausing when someone addressed him, redirecting his attention with the kind of patience that requires no effort because it isn't performance. Several people in the room that night later recalled the same specific detail without being asked: his hands. Not their size, though they were notable, index finger to heel measured more than 8 inches, but the way they rested. When Wayne was listening to someone, his hands hung at his sides without fidgeting, without occupying themselves with a drink or a cigarette or the particular ritual restlessness that most people use to manage the discomfort of sustained attention. They just hung there, still, the way tools hang on a wall when the work is done. He had been in the corridor for approximately 12 minutes when McQueen's group materialized from the adjacent green room. He knew McQueen. They had crossed paths at industry functions several times over the previous 3 years. He respected what he knew of the man's work ethic. McQueen did his own stunts, showed up prepared, and took the physical side of performance seriously. Wayne had said as much in at least one recorded interview from that period. The respect was professional. The warmth, if there had ever been much, was not on display that evening. Wayne heard McQueen's remarks. He heard all of them. He did not respond immediately. He stood still, and he looked at McQueen the way a carpenter looks at a joint that isn't quite true. Not with anger, not with wounded feeling, but with the particular focused attention of someone assessing a problem they intend to solve correctly. One of the 11 witnesses in that corridor, a production executive named Harold Mirisch, who spoke about the incident in a 1989 interview, described what he saw in those few seconds between McQueen's words landing and Wayne's first movement. He just looked at him, Mirisch said. Not a stare. Not a challenge. He was just reading something. That's not passivity. That's calculation. And what happened next, nobody in that corridor expected. McQueen's words had been precise. That was the thing about him. He was not a man who swung wildly. He chose targets with the same deliberateness he brought to the wheel of a race car at Sebring, where he had competed the previous year and placed second in class. The thrust of what he said, reconstructed from the accounts of those present, ran approximately as follows. That Wayne's kind of Western, the slow, moralistic cavalry and frontier mythology that Ford had built and Wayne had inhabited for 3 decades, was dying not because audiences had grown sophisticated, but because they had grown up. That the John Wayne picture was, at its core, A children's story told to adults who hadn't finished letting go of childhood. That the box office numbers Wayne's people cited were nostalgia money, not genuine enthusiasm. And that there was a difference, and the industry was beginning to understand what the difference meant. He said it at normal conversational volume, to the group he was with, but the corridor acoustics carried it clearly to Wayne 7 feet away. It was the kind of comment that could be technically denied. I was speaking to my people. I wasn't addressing you directly. While functioning as a perfectly targeted public challenge. McQueen had used the technique before. He understood social geometry. Wayne received it in silence. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Harold Mirisch later counted it that specifically, because he said he found himself holding his breath and was aware of exactly how long his breath stayed held. A director named James Lee Barrett, who had written the screenplay for The Sons of Katie Elder, the very film McQueen had used as his point of entry, moved slightly in Wayne's direction during those 4 seconds. Not to intervene physically, but the instinct was there, the social reflex to insert a body between two things that might collide. Wayne's left hand moved, just slightly, just a few inches away from his side, and Barrett stopped. Nobody present could have told you whether Wayne's hand had communicated a signal or simply moved. But Barrett stopped. Wayne looked at McQueen for another second. Then he did something that no one in that corridor had anticipated. He smiled. Not the slow, calculating smile McQueen had been wearing. Something different, quieter, and in its quietness somehow more unsettling. And then he said, at a volume barely above conversational, "You finished?" McQueen's arms, which had been crossed, uncrossed slightly. "Walk with me," Wayne said. He had already turned toward the far end of the corridor before McQueen answered. 3 seconds of silence. Then McQueen pushed off the wall and followed. The 11 witnesses stood in the corridor and looked at each other. The room went silent. Nobody on that set moved. What happened in the next 14 minutes took place in a small wardrobe room at the east end of the Pantages Backstage corridor. A room approximately 12 feet by 18 feet, containing 2 clothing racks, a low bench, 3 wooden chairs, and a standing mirror. A single overhead bulb. The door was not locked, and it was not entirely closed. 2 witnesses, Harold Mirisch and a costume assistant named Patricia Dane, who happened to be working late in an adjacent space. Both reported hearing portions of the conversation that followed. In the first 60 seconds, according to Mirisch, there was no conversation at all. Wayne had moved to one side of the small room and stood with his back partly to McQueen, examining the clothing rack beside him with no apparent purpose. Running his thumb along the sleeve of a hanging jacket, the way a man might run his thumb along the spine of a book he's read before. McQueen stood near the door. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile. It was, Mirisch recalled, the silence of a room where the person with the question hasn't decided yet whether to ask it. McQueen asked it. "What do you want?" Wayne turned. "To talk to you without an audience," he said. "That's all." In the second minute, Wayne sat down on one of the wooden chairs. He sat the way he always sat, squarely, both feet flat on the floor, without the studied casualness that men who are performing ease deploy when they want to signal ease. He looked at McQueen and said something that none of the partial accounts agree on perfectly, but which Mirisch reconstructed as follows. That he had no argument with McQueen's read of the market. That the numbers McQueen was citing were, in fact, accurate. That the Western as a genre was changing and that audiences were changing with it. And that Wayne had known this for several years and had been thinking about what it meant longer than McQueen might assume. McQueen, according to Mirisch, said nothing to this. He was still standing. "What you set out there," Wayne continued, and here Mirisch said his voice shifted. Not louder, but with a quality of weight that Mirisch described as the difference between a plank of wood and a plank of iron. "You said it in front of people who are going to remember that you said it. Some of them are going to decide that what you said tells them something about who you are." McQueen said, "It's a free country." Wayne looked at him for a moment. "It is," he agreed. "Then, sit down." McQueen sat. What followed, over the next 9 minutes, was not a lecture. Both Mirisch's account and Patricia Dane's partial impressions from the adjacent room are consistent on this point. Wayne did not perform authority, did not invoke his seniority or his credits or the accumulated weight of 4 decades in the industry. He spoke, instead, about a specific principle that he had apparently spent considerable time developing. A principle about the relationship between public challenge and private truth. The kernel of it, as Mirisch recalled it, was this. That the most expensive thing a man in their business could spend was not money or time, but the goodwill of people who were watching to see how he handled being in a room with someone he needed to be better than. That the challenge McQueen had delivered in the corridor was not incorrect. It was, in fact, well-targeted and well-executed, but that its target was wrong. Wayne was not the thing McQueen needed to be better than. The thing McQueen needed to be better than was the version of himself that needed to say it in front of 11 people. McQueen was quiet. Wayne leaned back in the chair, and the chair creaked once beneath him. "You're going to be very good," he said. "You might already be. I don't say that because I'm trying to give you something. I say it because it's the observable truth, and I've been observing this business for 40 years, and I can tell the difference between a man who is going to matter and a man who isn't." He paused. "But you're 36 years old, and you're still spending your talent proving things to rooms. That's not a criticism. That's a diagnosis." The word diagnosis is the one that both Mirish and Dane independently remembered. It was specific enough and unusual enough to stick. McQueen said nothing for what Mirish estimated to be 7 seconds. Then, "And you stopped needing to prove things when?" Wayne thought about this. Genuinely thought about it. The kind of pause that comes from actual reflection, not performance of reflection. "Around the time I stopped caring whether the room knew the answer," he said, "and started caring whether I did." The silence this time was different. Patricia Dane, working in the adjacent room with the door slightly ajar, said she heard the quality of the silence change. "It went from a tense silence to a thinking silence," she said in a 2002 interview for a Wayne biography project. "You can hear the difference if you know what to listen for." Wayne stood. He moved toward the door, and McQueen, who was sitting in the chair now with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, made no move to stop him or follow. At the door, Wayne paused. He turned back, not fully, and said one more thing. "The audience you're worried about losing," he said. "They're not going anywhere. They're just getting harder to impress. That's not a threat. That's an opportunity." He opened the door and walked back into the corridor. McQueen sat in the wardrobe room alone for another 4 minutes before he came out. 42 witnesses. 14 minutes. One lesson that lasted a career. When McQueen emerged from the wardrobe room, the 11 people who had been in the corridor were mostly gone. The reception had wound down in the interim, and the backstage spaces were emptying toward the exits. Harold Mirish was still there, ostensibly finishing his drink, but, by his own admission, waiting to see what would happen. McQueen found Wayne near the east exit, collecting his jacket from a peg on the wall. He approached without theater, without the particular preparation that people use when they are about to perform a magnanimous gesture. He walked up to Wayne, and he said, quietly and without preamble, "You were right about the room." Wayne looked at him. "I know," he said. Not dismissively, factually. The statement of a man who had not been uncertain. "About the other thing," McQueen said. "The diagnosis." He paused. "How long does it take?" Wayne pulled on his jacket, adjusted the collar. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Longer than you want it to. Shorter than you're afraid it will." McQueen nodded once. Not the nod of capitulation. Not the gesture of a man who has been defeated and is accepting terms. It was something more specific than that. The nod of a craftsman who has just been shown a technique he didn't know and can already feel the use of it. Mirish, watching from 8 feet away, described it later as the most honest thing I saw in 20 years of Hollywood receptions. Wayne extended his hand. McQueen took it. The handshake lasted 2 seconds. Not the prolonged grip of men sealing an emotional pact, but the clean, definite handshake of two professionals acknowledging something true. "You'll figure it out," Wayne said. "You're too smart not to." He walked out. McQueen stood at the east exit of the Pantages for a moment, jacket over his arm, the burgundy carpet beneath his feet and the fluorescent corridor buzzing faintly overhead. Then he put on his jacket and walked out into Hollywood Boulevard. The thing that changed in that room, and this is not metaphor, this is the testimony of people who watched it happen, was not McQueen's ambition or his drive or his talent, none of which needed changing. What changed was the target. Before that conversation, McQueen had been directing a significant portion of his considerable energy toward the work of being seen as better than something. After it, that energy began, incrementally and not without setbacks, to redirect toward the work of being better than himself. That's not defeat. That's not what happened in that room. That's the rarest thing in any industry. A correction that arrived before the cost of the error had fully accumulated. Years later, specifically in the spring of 1971, 5 years after the Pantages corridor. Steve McQueen was in pre-production for a film that would become one of the definitive works of his career. He was in a meeting with a young director, 28 years old, who had just finished his first feature and was nervous in a way that he was working hard not to show. The director was performing, deploying the arsenal of confident postures that young talent deploys when it is trying to appear as though it doesn't need approval. McQueen sat across from him and listened without expression. When the director finished his pitch, McQueen said, "You're not talking to me. You're talking to the room you think is watching." The director stopped. He looked at McQueen. "There's nobody else here," he said. "I know," McQueen said. The director later told this story in a 1984 interview, describing it as the single most useful piece of professional guidance he had received in his career. He passed it, in turn, to at least 3 actors he subsequently worked with over the following decade, none of whom knew its origin, none of whom knew that the man who had given it to McQueen was John Wayne, standing in a backstage corridor on a Monday night in March 1966, in a charcoal wool jacket, with hands the size of dinner plates and the patience of bedrock. That is how lessons move through a craft. Not in manifestos or credits or acceptance speeches. In rooms. In corridors. In the particular silence of 2 people when one of them says something true. Return now to that corridor in the Pantages. The fluorescent tubes still buzzing. The burgundy carpet. The mirror on the wall, floor to ceiling, wide enough for 2 men. What Wayne saw in that mirror, what he had perhaps been seeing clearly for years by then, was not a challenger. It was a young man in the process of spending talent on the wrong target, at a rate that, if continued, would extract a cost he might not be able to afford. What he chose to do with what he saw was the whole of the story. He didn't announce it. He didn't perform it. He walked to the end of the corridor and opened a door. That's not strategy. That's not image management. That's the observable difference between a man who has worked out what matters and a man who is still working it out. One corridor. One door. One lesson that history almost forgot. The room you're playing to will always be smaller than the work you're capable of. The target that requires an audience will always be smaller than the target that doesn't. The challenge delivered in front of 11 people will always cost more than the correction offered in a room of 2. John Wayne knew this at 59 in a way that Steve McQueen was learning to know it at 36. And the gap between knowing and learning is precisely the distance between a legend and a star. But there was one confrontation John Wayne never spoke about publicly. One moment in this same period where it wasn't Wayne doing the teaching, where the roles were, for reasons no one who was present has ever fully explained, reversed. And the reason he kept silent about it, for the rest of his life, for the 43 years that the story sat unrecorded in the recollections of the 3 people who witnessed it. That's a story for another time.